The unexamined life is not worth living. Hello and welcome. This is John on behalf of xenotheory.org, and I want to thank you for choosing to be here and accompany me down the rabbit hole, where we pursue ideas under the impression that beauty and meaning are found by looking deeper and not further. Today we are doing a syntopical analysis of Plato's Allegory of the Cave in Book 7 of the Republic, along with Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey. I want to superimpose the hero's journey on top of the character or the prisoner in Plato's Allegory of the Cave to provide it with context and background and really to further emphasize these points for application and what we can learn from this. So if you ever heard of Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey, you can probably Google it and find a myriad of different search results in terms of diagrams and steps and numbers in this particular journey. You could find anything from 4 steps to, I don't know, probably over a few dozen with very descriptive analyses and subplots and subcontexts and all that. I don't want to make it unnecessarily complicated or convoluted. I Googled the Hero's Journey diagram. I found a particular one that had 12 specific steps to it. Now I'm going to list the steps out for bullet points, and then we're going to simply dive into the Plato's Allegory of the Cave to look at background context for analysis, and we'll move through everything sequentially. So the 12 points in the hero's journey that we're going to use are the following. First is stasis. Second is the call. Third is the refusal of the call. Fourth is the mentor or the guide. Fifth is crossing the threshold. Sixth is coming across challenges. Seventh is the abyss or the main villain or enemy. 8th step is the climax or the victory. 9th is the refusal of the return. 10th is the return. 11th is the elixir. 12th is the ascent or the evolution. So with that framework in mind, we are going to dive into Plato's Allegory of the Cave. I'm going to read some quotes or paragraphs or ideas from the allegory and apply them to, and use these 12 steps to find them. So I thought, a quick side note, it was actually interesting when I was reading the Allegory of the Cave, almost all of these steps actually happen in this specific order, 1 through 12. I only have to change, I believe it's 8 and 9, which is the climax and the refusal of return, around in terms of how they appear in the text of the allegory itself. So with all of that said, let's dive into the first step in the hero's journey, which is stasis. Now, this is when we are complacent, when we are in complete comfort, when we are in certainty, everything is in order, everything is predictable, we have complete control over everything, there is no obstacles, there's no challenges. We know that we are creatures of habit. We are in stasis a lot more than we are led to believe. And we also, I think it's also to include in this point here that an object in motion, of course, what stays in motion, just as an object at rest tends to remain at rest. Newton's law, obviously. And I think it takes most effort, most energy, expenditure to leave stasis. I would say it's about 80% of our energy to actually move, and then momentum would handle and carry the rest. So in Plato's Allegory of the Cave, stasis looks as follows. Plato says, "Behold, human beings living in an underground den, which has a mouth open towards the light and reaching along the den. Here they have been from their childhood, and have their legs and neck chained so that they cannot move and only see before them, being prevented by the chains from turning their heads. Above and behind them is a fire blazing at a distance. Between the fire and the prisoners there is a raised way, and you will see, if you look, a low wall built along the way, like the screen which marionette players have in front of them, over which they show the puppets." So I'll actually include an image here in the video of Plato's Allegory of the Cave. It's pretty simple. You have these prisoners that are just fixated on one specific area. They can only see a two-dimensional representation or a silhouette of an image that is passing between them and the fire behind them. So they can't really interact with this world that's behind them, which is, of course, true reality, these true three-dimensional images, but they're being forced to only look at the casted projection of them. So they as far as they're concerned, those are the real objects. That is reality, what they see in front of their eyes. And that is complete stasis. Like I said, there's no other obstacles in front of them. There's no other potential realities. Everything is accounted for. Everything is predictable. They know everything that is going on. Now, in the next step, we have the call to adventure. So the call to adventure would simply be realizing potential. It's exposing the mundane reality that we might live in. It's exposing the staleness of life or our current situation. Maybe it's not exciting, maybe it's not challenging, maybe it's monotonous, it's not really enjoyable. So I would say the call to adventure would be realizing some potential in some way, and that is encapsulated in Plato's Allegory of the Cave, simply with the release of a prisoner. So he says, "And now look again and see what would naturally follow if the prisoners are released and disabused of their error." So if for some reason one of them was freed from their chains, and they had the freedom to move their head or stand up or look around. That would be the call to adventure. They can either explore that new potential reality, or they can be complacent out of fear or mediocrity, and then just sit down, even though there's no external entities holding them there. They would choose to be there out of fear or out of comfort. So that would be a call to adventure. And obviously that is, we have free will imbued into this conversation. So there's a potential of refusing this call to adventure. So that would be the prisoner remaining seated, of course. And there's plenty of psychological justifications or philosophical justifications why a particular prisoner might be inclined to refuse a call. Plato lists these as the following. If he's compelled to stand up and turn around his neck and walk and look toward the light, he will suffer sharp pains. The glare will distress him. He will be unable to see the realities in which his former state he has seen the shadows. And then he would conceive someone saying to him that what he saw before was an illusion. The shadows were an illusion. But that now, when he is approaching nearer and nearer to being, and his eye is turned toward more real existence, he has a clearer vision. What will be his reply? And you may further imagine that his instructor is pointing to the objects as they pass and requiring him to name them. Will he not be perplexed? So there's a lot of, I guess, crises that might happen, or reasons, like I said, justifications that could lead this individual to refuse this call. So I think the most important thing we can remember in this particular step of the refusal of the call, a principle that we can always remember is the following. I would say we should value constructive truth over emotional comfort. So constructive truth, obviously this prisoner is being offered the potentiality to experience a new world, to experience new insights, new experiences, new wisdom. And he has to hold that in his value hierarchy above his emotional comfort, above familiarity, right? So this leads to the next point in the hero's journey, which is the mentor or the guide. Now, I would just define this as some external entity that is aiding in this process, that is encouraging you to choose the call, I would say. And this would be the possibility of a true item. So if this prisoner looked around and he saw, the silhouette of a vase on the wall that he was been accustomed to experiencing, if he turned around and saw it in front of the fire, like suspended in the air, he would realize, okay, that is an external entity that's validating my hypotheses that this potential new world might be more desirable than my old world. So it's anything that's outside himself that's going to provide him with a little bit of assistance, necessary assistance to cross the threshold, which leads me into the next point, which is crossing the threshold, the fifth point. And this is as follows. Suppose once more that he is reluctantly dragged up a steep and rugged ascent and held fast until he is forced into the presence of the sun itself. Is he not likely to be pained and irritated? When he approaches the light, his eyes will be dazzled, and he will not be able to see anything at all of what are now called realities. So this would lead the prisoner to be completely incompetent, completely overwhelmed, completely, you could argue, in danger, completely in uncertainty, in chaos. And this is going to lead to the successive step, of course, of challenges or enemies. And these are listed by Plato from the following. He will require to grow accustomed to the sight of the upper world. At first, he will see the shadows best, next the reflections of men and other objects in the water, and then the objects themselves. He will gaze upon the light of the moon and the stars and the spangled heaven, and he will see the sky and the stars by night better than the sun or the light of the sun by day. So this would lead to an inevitable, I would say, kind of existential crisis, right? Because he's in this new world. He's ill-equipped to deal with this new reality. There's a adjustment phase, I would say, because again, he only would be accustomed to shadows, and Plato's, articulating this. He would eventually look at shadows, and then reflections, and then silhouettes, etc., and then he would finally get to the objects themselves. And I think by the sun and the light thing, it could be metaphorical in terms of like looking at more intellectual, explorations into the nature behind a intangible impulse. So this prisoner, he's only experiencing the differentiation between physical items, right? He's only saying, okay, this is a distinction, this is a disparity. He might extrapolate that and say, okay, what are these intangible psychological beliefs that I've entertained? Those might be completely wrong. I might have to polarize those too. So that would be obviously very challenging for this individual, right? So this would eventually lead to the seventh step in the journey, which is the abyss. Okay, you can look at this, death and rebirth, the main villain. And this is in Allegory of the Cave as the following. I think that he would rather suffer anything than entertain these false notions and live in this miserable manner. Imagine once more, I said, such a one coming suddenly out of the sun to be replaced in his old situation. Would he not be certain to have his eyes full of darkness? So I think this would be the sense of like the main enemy, the main abyss, the main villain in this Plato's Allegory of the Cave would be the psychological state that this prisoner had to go through, had to lose. And I think it's better to lose something that you had than, sorry, it's not better. It's harder to lose something that you've had than lose what you could have been, if that makes sense. So this prisoner is dealing with, okay, I've had this reality, I grew accustomed to this old reality in the cave, and I lost that completely. Completely lost that lifestyle. I have no idea where I am now. I have no idea how to think, what to do, how to behave, how to act, what to believe, and that would be more difficult than him being in the, you can argue it's more difficult than him being in the cave and losing the possibility, because the possibility, it's a psychological extrapolation into the future. He doesn't know what the future holds. He doesn't know what the earthly realm holds. He doesn't know what reality is. So you're only losing a thought concept, and I don't think there's as much psychological baggage there. There's not as much of a emotional reaction to losing a potential than losing what you actually have. So that would be the abyss. That would be the main villain, is this prisoner. He can never go back to his old way of life. His paradigm has completely shifted. Even if he chose, even if he, succumbed to fear at this particular moment and wanted to turn around and go back to stasis, back to safety, he's experienced that new world. And it's just, there's a lot of cognitive dissonance. There's a lot of psychological disturbances and turmoil that he's going to be living in. And I would look at that as the main villain, the main death and rebirth process in this particular journey. So the next one is the climax, is the surmounting of this main obstacle. And this is as follows. In the world of knowledge, the idea of good appears last of all and is seen only with an effort. And when it is seen, it is also inferred to be the universal author of all things beautiful and right, parent of light and the Lord of light in this visible world. So I think this prisoner had extracted the necessary implications and the necessary insights and belief analysis from exposure to these new circumstances long enough. And there's a lot of courage, obviously, that's underpinning this entire journey. I think particularly in the refusal of the call, which we're going to get to in a few minutes here. But that would be the climax, him really completely acclimating to this new world, really surmounting this new identity shift, really surmounting this new belief about the world. So he's okay with living a brand new life. He's okay with, okay, I'm never going to be able to go back to this old world of safety, even if I want to. So out of mere proximity, he is acclimated to this new world. He's acclimated to this new third dimensional reality of these true objects of the true light, instead of a false projected reality that he spent his entire upbringing in. So this was just simply accomplished, I would say, through courage and exposure, right? And the next point is the refusal of the return. So there's a quick note here. There's an ethical predicate. This is predicated on there's an ethical obligation to return to your old city. And this could be in terms of providing your city with something, returning to stasis in some way, providing inspiration to these members to know that it's possible to live this new reality. If they're seeking a new insight, if they're seeking new experiences, you can substantiate that in proof of your existence, in proof of your journey returning. So there's somewhat of an ethical obligation, I would argue. And I agree with Plato in the sense that it's their moral imperative to return and provide to these similar situations that they have experienced in their upbringing. In short, they are becoming the person that they needed in their life when they were younger. So they're giving back in a sense. So the refusal of the return can look like this. If he was going to return to his old state of stasis and look at the other prisoners, men would say of him that he went down and he came without his eyes, and that it was better to not even think of ascending. And if anyone tried to lose another and lead him up to the light, let him only catch the offender, and they would put him to death. So there's a lot of possibilities there. A lot of justifications on not returning to this place of stasis. There's a lot of jealousy from these other members of this place of stasis. There's a lot of envy. There's a lot of tribalism. There's a lot of me versus you. This whole phenomenon of, people call it the crabs in the bucket. Once one person tries to escape, they all pull it down out of psychological projection or displacement or insecurity or fear or, like I said, mainly envy or jealousy. So There's a lot of justifications for him not to do this, but again, he looks at his moral imperative to do that over this potential social criticism. So he looks at that and he does it anyway. He passes this threshold again. So this leads us into the next point, which is the return. So the return in Plato's Allegory of the Cave is essentially the following. He says, I mean that they remain in the upper world. Let me back up one second. When they have ascended and seen enough, we must not allow them to do as they do now. And the dialogue says, what do you mean? I mean that they remain in the upper world. But this must not be allowed. They must be made to descend again among the prisoners in the den and partake of their labors and honors, whether they are worth having or not. So this is going back to what I was saying. There's a moral obligation to become the type of person that you needed when you were younger and giving back to that particular community, living as an example, whether it's giving something of tangible value or intangible insight or experience, or simply at the most fundamental level, living as example, providing them with the possibility that they can surmount, they can reenact this journey themselves. You are living proof that it can be done. Okay. You have a moral imperative to do that, an obligation. So this prisoner does choose to return, and then he has an elixir, I would say. And this is simply the comprehensive perspective of both potential realities, because this person has a more full and more developed, a more inflated view of both realities, because he has lived in this prisoner in this cave. This prisoner has lived in this cave and has also experienced the third dimensional reality. So he can make a value judgment on, okay, this is worth living, this is not worth living, this is preferable, this is more comprehensive, this is more constructive, this is more provided with value than the other state. And people can do this. People can, like the prisoners might be able to argue, oh, this is better. The other world is more dangerous. They might refuse the call. They might say it's other dangerous, but they only have half of a perspective on something, right? So you can't really say like one is better than the other if you only have a incomplete perspective. Prime example, if I tell people I've been really disciplined and persistent on a dietary regime in terms of because I want to value my, I don't know, maybe let's say physique ratios or circumference measurements or health results over the taste of a particular food or sweets, and they might say, oh, it's not worth it. Okay. And if they've never been in a certain shape or achieved a certain physique or a certain strength level, that's an incomplete perspective. That is psychological projection and displacement. They've only experienced that realm of, okay, hedonistic pleasure of eating whatever you want to eat, like a child, I would argue. And they haven't really experienced what it's like to perform at their best, at their peak, right? Peak performance. So being at peak performance feels better than anything good tastes, if that makes sense. Nothing tastes as good as peak performance feels, better way to say it. And once you experience both, then you can make a more apt and valuable judgment on that has more merit. You can have a judgment on that's going to say this is better than this. This is preferable to that because you've experienced both worlds comprehensively. And similar thing with these prisoners or the prisoner that is returning, however. So he has the elixir, which is a comprehensive view. And this is in the Plato's Allegory as follows. Each of you, when his turn comes, must go down to the general underground abode and get into the habit of seeing in the dark. When you have acquired the habit, you will see 10,000 times better than the inhabitants of the den, and you will know what the several images are and what they represent, because you have seen the beautiful and good and just in their truth. So again, comprehensive perspective, which is, as Plato is proposing, 10,000 times better than a half of a perspective on something. So the final step in this journey is the ascent and the evolution. And he says this process is not the turning over of an oyster shell, but the turning round of a soul passing from day, which is little better than night, to the true day of being. That is the ascent from below, which we affirm to be true philosophy. So this is an omnipresent phenomenon, this entire hero's journey, all of these 12 steps. This can be in the macrocosm of your life or the microcosm of a particular, this can be even encapsulated in one argument with somebody, in a relationship, in a dynamic, in one day, in one experience with a new piece of information. And keep in mind, we are always existing at the first two states. Okay, so stasis, obviously that's just complacency. That's exactly where you are right now. And you always have a new call to adventure. This can be, again, a possibility, an opportunity, some experience with a potential new reality or a potential new belief or a new way of living. You are always subject to experience calls to adventure. And I think a lot of people end up refusing the call. They miss out on this third step. So I think this third step of refusal of the call is what we can focus on for the practical application. And a really valuable way to do this is like I said, in the step itself, we should value constructive truth over emotional comfort. So how to do this would be to instill the value in you of adventure being more important and desirable than security. Okay, you're going to die anyway. You have to pay one of two pains. You have to pay the uncomfort of or discomfort rather of being uncertain, of being overwhelmed, of confronting chaos in terms of adventure, just like any hero does in their journey. Yes, that's undesirable. Yes, it's painful. It could be even traumatic. But you also, if you don't pay that pain, you have to pay the pain of long-term regret, of shame, of embarrassment, of dwelling on the past, of a bad conscience, which is soul eating. So I would say that's a lot more dense. It's a lot more damaging than the initial pain of, okay, I'm just going to get out of my comfort zone, face my fear, and execute on what I need to execute on. So value adventure over security, and instill another value that it is better to be strong than it is to be safe. You can never fully isolate yourself from all potential threats in the world, which would mean ideal safety, you could say, which is a state of stasis in itself. So we know that's dangerous. You can never fully isolate yourself from all of the threats. So I think a better approach can be to deliberately and voluntarily expose yourself to threats that are surmountable, that you can handle. Of course, don't be foolish and overwhelm yourself, but if you voluntarily expose yourself, just as the physical body does in the gym, you will acclimate yourself to become stronger and stronger and stronger and more resilient and more capable of dealing with chaos and contributing agents and enemies and obstacles and challenges in the future, which, as we know, are inevitable and omnipresent. So, in closing, again, value constructive truth over emotional comfort. We can go over this journey every single day of our lives, and all of us are somewhere in this journey in every single aspect of our life. But I think the one underlying virtue that is underpinning this entire hero's journey, and also the entire journey of the prisoner in Plato's Allegory of the Cave, is courage. So do what we can to cultivate courage, and I think it's like a muscle. In our next video, I'm actually going to discuss courage and fear, how we're addressing fear. So we're going to talk about that in a week or so. But yeah, so in closing, we have a tendency to find what we are looking for. I hope you find value.